Welcome to Montgomery Smashing the Stigma, a podcast that shares stories about mental health and wellness and connects people with groups and solutions to help smash the stigma about getting help.
Hi everyone, I'm Connie Gaylor, and welcome to Montgomery Smashing the Stigma podcast.
And I'm Amy Frederick. Joining us on the podcast is Brian Valasek, steward and owner of Beyond Your Valley. Beyond Your Valley is located in Blue Ash, Ohio. It offers mental health counseling, psychiatric services to overcome trauma, addiction, depression, and anxiety.
Today we want to talk about the difference between stress, anxiety, and depression. When is anxiety real anxiety or just going through some stressful times? And when is depression real depression, or maybe you're just going through a tough patch, some sadness? That's we kind of want to put some definitions behind that and see if there is a clear, delineation between them, or if they're kind of just related. As we go into it a little bit deeper, what would your thoughts be on that?
That's a great question. And there is some delineation and some crossover. So that's why it's a hard question to answer. The best way I've ever conceptualized this, and I want to include stress. So anxiety, stress, and depression, because you mentioned stress as well. So anxiety is worry or stuckness about the future. Depression is worry or stuckness in the past. And stress is worry or stuckness in the present or near future. So that's the best way to understand it. So you say I'm stressed, it means you got too much stuff on your plate to handle, right? So it's related to tasks or perceived tasks or pressures or perceived pressures that you have or putting on yourself or whatever. So that's stress. We all have a lot of stress because we all like to be busy. We wear that like a badge of honor. So some more than others. So you want to figure out so when do you know if it's just worry and sort of situational anxiety almost and situational depression versus some clinical diagnostic, something that needs to be treated, right? I think that's part of the answer is it situational? So anxiety is you're worrying about everything all of the time. You have a pattern, a habit, a tendency to worry about everything. You wish you could stop it, but you can't turn it off. So your mind races with thought after thought after thought. What if, catastrophizing. It's going to get worse, worst case scenario. Not realistic worst case scenario, but like worst case scenario that you could possibly imagine. And then you act like you sort of plan for that to happen. You also might have beliefs about worry itself that are unhelpful, like all worrying helps me plan. No, some worrying helps you plan. So I think it's like a chronic worry that guides your life. That's anxiety that needs to be treated. We would call that generalized anxiety. There's all types of other anxiety, which is probably not a surprise. It can be more specific to social, or there's a specific, you're worried about illnesses, things like that. So that's anxiety. I hope that answers your question. I mean, again, we need a measure of anxiety. If you tell me I don't have any anxiety, I'm like, how are you living? Because you need a little bit of like pressure or worry. Because if you weren't worried about anything, you wouldn't plan for anything. You wouldn't do anything. You wouldn't accomplish anything. Right? So we need a little bit of that. It sparks creativity to some extent. So that's anxiety.
Okay.
Depression, I see it work two ways. Some people overuse the word "I'm depressed" when it's really situational sadness that's appropriate to the situation. Depression would be it's lasting longer than you would expect, given that situation, or there's no situation to point it to. It's just a deep, heavy feeling that comes over you that you start to believe the lies of depression. Like depression's wicked. You're not good enough. It's not going to work. It's not going to matter. So you feel hopeless. You feel helpless, and you feel stuck. And nothing you can do about it, and nobody else can help you either. So all the lies of depression in the book, they're DSM, they're symptoms. I call them lies of depression because it's the feeling becomes, I feel depressed, so I am depressed, so I'm going to keep doing depressed things. I'm going to lay in bed for 16 hours, whatever the case may be. I'm going to eat all day, I'm going to never eat, whatever. So those are the symptoms. That's when you know it's a problem, right? It starts to affect your functioning on a day-to-day basis, and you're not doing everything you normally would, right? So some people will use work. I go to work and I'm happy at work, and then I veg out and I'm a blob at home. Are you depressed? Probably. Just because you can turn it on at work doesn't mean you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it can hide. We may even know people where we loved ones and even coworkers or employees that have hidden their depression, and it's so that's why it's important that we talk about it, right? Because it can take so many shapes, and the person with depression is not incentivized to talk about it because he or she just does not believe it's going to make any difference.
So what can you do? So say, for instance, you see a loved one, they seem down. But when should you become, and everybody has their moments of feeling down, but when should you tell them, that it's time to seek help? And then how do you get them to do that? Because it's one thing if you recognize it in yourself, but it's another thing when you see a loved one that's all of a sudden done a 180, and how do you convince them that it's time to seek help?
You said 3 interesting things. You said tell them, get them, and convince them. So basically you would not do those things. You would more listen to what's really going on, ask them how they've been feeling, what they've been noticing, share with them what you've been noticing, and that you're concerned about them. And I think one of the more effective questions is, after all of that exploration of what they're experiencing and your observations, is would you like to do something about it? What have you considered doing about it? Have you considered doing therapy? Not you should do therapy.
No, I think that's a great difference. Okay. Because I think some people are kind of like me. You just want to get in there and fix it, and that's exactly. Not going to work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know anybody who's ever followed advice from anyone.
No, trust me,
advice is the lowest form of help. It can be very powerful if if you've established authority and rapport with that person. But it's also not empowering. You want somebody who's seeking mental health, mental wellness, emotional wellness support. You want them to take the first move. That's empowering. Now they feel like, hey, it goes from hopeless to some measure of hope, just because they're the ones that picked up the phone. Although it's heavy, if they pick up the phone, metaphorically, because we don't do that anymore. If you send an email or text, and then that's already momentum. So you want them to do it.
So let's go back to when you were talking about anxiety.
Yeah.
What are some ways that you treat anxiety? Or how do you cope? Mm-hmm. What would you tell somebody how to cope?
Not a coping expert. Basically find different outlets for your anxiety, but I would say also different uses for your anxiety. I would help that person look for where their anxiety is actually helpful to channel that anxious energy into something productive. And then how do you define help that person figure out where is it excessive? And then with the excessive, we're only working on the excessive. That's why we don't want to get rid of all of it. It's not bad. It's a thing. It's a feeling. So using that excessive, what do you do with that excessive energy, anxious energy or anxious thought? Well, meditation is helpful, mindful activities. The first thing somebody with anxiety is going to say when you say, you should do mindfulness, is, my mind is racing, this ain't going to work. Well, noticing that your mind racing is doing mindfulness. And the goal isn't to clear your mind of all things. The goal is to notice what you're noticing. So mindfulness is a great tool. Journaling is a great tool. Nature, going outside is a great tool. Connecting with other people, sharing them what you're thinking about and feeling. Doing stuff that gives you a sense of purpose. All of those are things that are helpful for anxiety. And I suppose a lot of those would be helpful for depression too.
Is that how you start when you treat depression, with that sort of level, or is medication involved for some people?
Yeah, it's certainly medication is a part for some people, and where you start depends on where people come in. I think for most people, yes, you would start with how are you coping with it? How are you handling it right now? What are you already doing? Well, what can you do more of?
Well, I think it's unique to the person.
Yeah, totally.
So I'm sure that there's not just one standard type of answer that you can get, but there's got to be some kind of an initial conversation, and then that's how you determine, how that treatment goes. I mean, is it with a counselor who's just talking things through because maybe that's all that person needs? Or is it psychiatric care like we were talking before? Now it may require some kind of a medication or a different type of therapy that a counselor can't do. So it's one of those things that it does. We talked about there's no clear delineation because a lot of times it overlaps.
So yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of. My head is swimming with this. Is basically somebody. You realize when you start unpacking things how deep the anxiety runs, or how elaborate it is, or how entrenched it is, and then it's like, well, we're going to need some medications on board so that we can start figuring this out and parsing it out, because you're too anxious just sitting here. That's another metric of when you would need if you're distracted by if you're doing trauma work and you're distracted by flashbacks, nightmare, and you can't sleep and you haven't slept for 3 days. I mean, whatever. You got to look on like Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the foundational levels of our physical needs and emotional, and then love and belonging and everything else as you go up. But yeah, the answer is it depends. But here's another thought I'm thinking about is, so for anxiety, Amy, you said what treatment? Well, a lot of behavioral therapy, a lot of action-oriented, sort of, if you're afraid of something, go do that thing, right? Either systematic desensitization or gradual exposure, it's called, or flooding. Most people, if you give them the two choices, they're going to say, no, don't throw me in a snake pit. They're going to say, let's work our way up to this. A simple example with social anxiety would be start a conversation. You're afraid of what people will think? Well, confront that, get into that, say something, say it, or you could do it sort of paradoxically and act like an idiot, and then sort of brush up against that belief that you are an idiot, and you realize, oh, the world didn't end when I acted like an idiot, so whatever. I guess everything's okay, or things are okay. So for anxiety, there's a lot of behavior or cognitive behavior. A lot of it's thought based. Those can be very helpful. I have found, however, as a CBT therapist myself, that for depression, that's not where you start. It's essentially stigmatizing, demoralizing. Well, you just need to, if the person across from you is getting the sense that all you need to do is change your thinking, when they're entrenched in this thinking, because the depression is so strong that they believe that what's depression is telling them is true, it's so rigid in the thinking, you can't change that. You cannot start there. So for depression, the first order of business is movement, like physical movement. Just, you don't feel like doing it. You what are you going to do, despite the fact that you don't feel like doing it? This isn't going to be just like happy clappy, do what makes you feel good. You're going to have to do, half of the answer is doing what you don't want to do, but you know it's good for you. And so physical movement starts to get your brain into different orientation, starts to open up things, you start to see new things, instead of just sitting on the couch staring at the tube, telling yourself the same story over and over.
Well, that's thought-provoking in itself, isn't it? Thinking about, just our tendencies to not get outside of our comfort zone and hope that we can get healing and treatment. And I know that, counselors and psychiatrists kind of meet you where you're at, but they're not going to leave you where you're at. And that's the biggest thing. You can't expect to be left where you're at, but yet overcome or move out of that. And I think that's where anxiety and depression keeps people. It keeps you, stuck, as you keep saying, right where you are. This is a great conversation to have, because, people need to hear just the real life of how this works and not just read it on a screen. people who work in the industry or, maybe have sought treatment and know that you have to put some hard work in, but it'd be beneficial to you in the end.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, well, we thank you for coming in, Brian, and sharing with us.
Why don't you give us your contact information again?
So beyondyourvalley.com. Our main phone number is 513-348-1780. You can reach us through our website there as well if you're trying to learn more about us or start therapy. And you can call me directly. My cell is 513-345-0741 if you want more information about Beyond Your Valley.
Thank you for joining us, Brian, and we want to thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. If you or a loved one are in a crisis and need immediate help, call or text the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988.